Okay, I'll start in just a couple minutes, I suppose. Hi, I'm good. Can you all hear me okay with this? Is it? All right. Hi, yeah, we talked on Facebook or whatever. Yeah, it's good to see you, Phil. Yeah, should I just start, do you think?
So there was a lot of people talking before my fix all that. Yeah. So I think we don't have any kind of official.
Got it. Excellent. Okay, welcome. It's 5:10, so let's go ahead and start this presentation on genetic engineering or designer babies or whatever we want to call it. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Scott Stiegemeyer. I am a Lutheran pastor, but I'm also a professor at Concordia University in Irvine, California. Yay, excellent. I appreciate the applause. Yes, so I teach theology there and church history and a couple of other things, but I'm mostly there to teach ethics for the nursing school. And bioethics, as you might grasp, is people that come to a conference like this will certainly understand this, that bioethics, medical ethics, is a very important field, particularly in the time and place in which we reside, in which we live. There are so many advances, there are so many different changes coming along with medicine and with science and technology that it boggles the mind. And so when I was asked to present for this conference, and I understand that when people think of medical ethics or bioethics or issues that pertain to the faith, Christian faith, and medicine, one of the things they think of is abortion. Another thing they think of is, especially now, is physician-assisted suicide. If you live in California, then you know that that has been legalized here. Or euthanasia, or some similar topic. But one thing that's been sort of on my heart and mind in the last year or so, and especially in the next few months, because I have some work that I'll be doing, is this topic, genetic engineering. And I'm going to speak for a few minutes or for a little while, but I do want to allow for time at the end for questions too. Questions or comments from you folks. Well, first, let's just do a test. There we go. Okay, perfect. That worked. I don't have a clicker, so my helper is upstairs going to move the slides forward for me. Why don't you go ahead and just advance? Yeah, let's put all those up there. Thank you. I don't know if you can, how well you can read that, but I want to just start with what we believe, teach, and confess as Christians. And of course, that's a big topic. You know, there's a lot of things that we believe, teach, and confess, but what is it that we believe, teach, and confess with regard to our faith and the ability to change human genes? Well, first, I think one of the most important things is that we confess that God is the creator of all life. all human life is a gift from the Creator. The second thing is that all natural descendants of Adam and Eve are corrupted by sin. All of us, accepting Jesus, are tainted by and polluted by that original sin, and then our own actual sin, which we add to that. The third thing is that all human beings, without exception, have inherent dignity. We are all born and created in the likeness and image of God. We have a value in the eyes of God. He has loved us with his everlasting love. And by the incarnation of the one eternal Son of God, Jesus affirmed that dignity, the dignity of human life, that human beings from the very first moment to their natural end have value. And then we will all rise on the last day. Whenever I teach this, it's interesting to me, undergrads often don't recognize this, even if they come from a Christian or semi-Christian background. In fact, I think this is one of the doctrines or teachings, as part of the message that we as Christians really need to make clear in this day and age, is the resurrection of the body. That we will live in a new creation, in a new heaven and new earth, in glorified bodily form. The specifics of what that's going to be like, I don't know, except for I know it will be without sin and without the corruption of disease and illness and death. But we will all rise bodily on the last day. I find that many people, like I said, many young people at least, do not understand that, do not realize that. A lot of people think that the Christian message is simply that when you die, your spirit leaves your body and you go to heaven and in some form, disembodied form forever. And that's not exactly the whole truth, right? We know that we will rise on the last day and live eternally in glorified fashion. And therefore, it matters. Lastly on my slide, it matters what we do with and to our bodies. Because God has chosen to honor the human body by being incarnate in the womb of the Virgin Mary, and to the blessing of our own bodily resurrection. This tells us something, and I think one of the things it tells us is that it does matter what we do with and to our bodies. There are a lot of assumed beliefs. There are a lot of underlying beliefs that people have about their bodies that affect the ethics or the questions that we're going to talk about today. And one of those underlying beliefs that many people have about their body is that their body is their possession, that they own their body, that they own themselves, that they are their own sort of Lord and Master. That means they can determine to do whatever they wish with their bodies. They can sell their bodies, they can modify their bodies, they can do all sorts of things to their bodies. Whereas I would suggest that as Christians, we would want to hold out a higher vision than that we are in fact temples of the Holy Spirit. We are in fact, we belong to our Lord and Maker. So with that sort of foundation, with those teachings in place and those assumptions dealt with, let's move to the next slide, if we could. There we go. The quest for better children. And I put that in quotes, better. When we talk about genetic engineering, there's actually a couple of ways we could go at this. One way we could go at this is to talk about genetic modification, genetic engineering for people that are like one of us, people that have been born, and people that are growing and grown, and maybe we have some need to modify ourselves. Okay, that's one topic. But another topic, a related topic, is the ability to modify our children. As science advances, we're going to be able to do more and more things to change the genetics of our children. And we will be presented with this technology, I think, whether we like it or not. I think that's coming down the pike. I think it's going to happen, and it will be really the role of the church to bear witness and to become informed about whether, just because we can do things doesn't always mean that we should do those things. All right, so there's two related technologies that already exist that come into play when we talk about wanting to have, quote unquote, better children. So the first one is in vitro fertilization, or otherwise known as IVF. And you probably know what this is, or many of you probably do. You've heard of in vitro fertilization. This is when eggs from a woman are fused with the sperm from a man in a petri dish. Okay, it used to be called test tube babies, but they're not actually in test tubes. There's no test tubes, but a petri dish. And in vitro literally means in glass, as opposed to in vivo, in the living body. So fertilization can take place in the glass or in the dish, the petri dish. Why would somebody do that? Well, someone might choose to have this process done because they are struggling with conception, that they are experiencing infertility, and they're struggling with the desire to have their own natural children. And so as a remedy for that, they attempt to have children through in vitro fertilization. Now, the problem that we might run into as Christians who are pro-life with something like in vitro fertilization is that, well, there's probably a couple of reasons that someone might object. The Catholic Church, of course, is sort of famous for their position on this. But we would also, I think, have some concerns, whether you're Roman Catholic or not, we would have some concerns as pro-life people with in vitro fertilization, simply because typically when eggs are retrieved from the woman and fertilized artificially in the petri dish, there might be as many as 10, 12, or 15 embryos created. And it's simply impossible to transfer that many living human embryos to a woman. She could never bear that many, wouldn't be safe, wouldn't be possible. So typically, only maybe 2, possibly 3 will be attempted to be transferred to the mother, with maybe 1 of them successfully implanting. The question for pro-life believers then is, what do we do with the remainder embryos? And there's only a few options. One option would be to freeze them and perhaps use them later on. Another option would be to simply destroy them or discard them. And then there's also the option of using them for research, which results in their destruction. Those are the main options, but people are using in vitro fertilization, probably in our churches, as a means to combat infertility. And we just need to be aware and begin to think through this together. What does this mean that we would have these surplus embryos? Okay. Now, the next technology that I have on the screen is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And what this is, it's a fancy word. You might just say PGD, just like the other one is IVF. In medicine, they like to abbreviate, just like in religion. We do that too, LCMS or whatever. So PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, is where they will take a cell or a few cells from an embryo that has been created through IVF and test them for genetic abnormalities. And if there are abnormalities, then a decision must be made. Will this embryo be used? Will this embryo be discarded? So on and so forth. So pre-implantation means that before they transfer the embryo to the woman, they tested for genetic abnormalities or genetic diseases. These are things we already do, or people already do and can do. And the reason that I'm spending a little bit of time talking about these technologies is because when the PGD is performed, if there is some sort of abnormality, then we might be able to eventually cure the abnormality. That's one option that is coming down the pike. So let's just advance the slide a couple of times. Let's do one more. All right. So let's talk about CRISPR for a few moments too. Just a show of hands, anybody in here, have you heard of CRISPR? Do you know what the CRISPR is? A couple of you do, but not everybody does. All right, so CRISPR technology is relatively new. It's been around for a couple of years, and I have the words for what the acronym stands for up on the screen. You're not going to remember it. I can't remember it from one presentation to the next, but it's clustered, regularly interspersed, short palindromic repeats. Okay, that's quite a mouthful. It's more than we can manage probably. But what that means is CRISPR technology is a means of going into a cell and snipping and altering the genes, specific genes, in a cell. Okay. Now that cell might be of a plant, it might be of an animal, or it might be a human embryo. If we can do this with plants and animals, we are able to do this with human beings too. So CRISPR is a fairly new technology, and it refers to another way to put it would be gene editing. If there's an error, you edit. Okay, so benefits for this. Well, the benefits for doing why would we do something like this? Why invent this technology? It's very powerful technology. There have been other means or methods that have been invented to alter the genetic makeup of a cell, but CRISPR is kind of unique or special because it is relatively inexpensive and it is relatively easy and it is very accurate. So a lot of people are very excited about it. One of the advantages or one of the potential benefits for CRISPR is that we can cure diseases. That there might be genetic diseases such as cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs or sickle cell, and many, actually there are hundreds of genetic diseases. And many of them are very rare, but it is exciting on one level, I think, to think that we can go in and cure genetic diseases, these devastating diseases, by editing the specific genes of an embryo. Other possible benefits, and I'm just going to put things out there and talk about them as we move along. Some people will want to use CRISPR technology or similar technologies to modify plants and animals. Why would we do that? Well, to develop hardier foods, to develop crops that will be able to resist drought or heat or pests, or that will produce better fruit, more nutritious fruit. We might desire to use this on animals for a couple of reasons. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Yeah, so we might be able to get food that has greater nutritional value, that will be more resistant to pests and blight, more resistant to harsh conditions such as drought and heat. That's what I was just talking about. We might also, and this is a little bit of a different topic, just to kind of whet your taste buds maybe. There are those who are proposing that we may be able to, using CRISPR and using cloning, which I'm not going to get into, but is also on the horizon for us, using cloning and CRISPR to possibly bring back species of animals and plants that have gone extinct. So there are some people that are kind of excited about that possibility. Whether that's a good idea or not is really a long conversation. What are some of the risks? Well, if we can cure diseases, we can also cause diseases. Either inadvertently, if we go in and start modifying genes to make the embryo healthy and well, there might be unintended problems that we cause. Even as we are curing one thing, we might be causing problems in another area, because genes often don't just do one thing. And when you start, and we don't fully understand, and it'll be a long time before, if we ever fully understand the way that the tens of thousands of genes in a human being really interact with each other. So we may inadvertently cause diseases. It's also possible that this technology, this CRISPR technology, this gene editing technology, could be weaponized, that it could be used to create biological warfare, germ warfare. So there's all sorts of potential risks. Now I don't know how well you can read that, but that fancy word at the bottom there, xenotransplantation. Xenotransplantation, sometimes whenever I give presentations, especially when I talk to undergrads or when I talk to youth, high school youth, if they've heard of any kind of medical sort of sci-fi type advances, one of them will be, what about growing human organs in animals, like primates or pigs? And so there's reasons why people want to do that. Why would you want to grow human kidneys in a pig? Well, because there's a shortage of healthy kidneys, and so maybe if we could grow human kidneys or human-like kidneys in another species. So that's what xenotransplantation is. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. All right. Some common objections that come up with people start to talk about editing genes. And so far I've been talking about mostly about editing the genes of plants and animals, or of curing diseases. But if we can edit the genes of a human embryo to cure it of cystic fibrosis, it is theoretically or hypothetically possible that we may one day be able to edit other traits of a human embryo. We might be able to, there are some traits that are related to single genes, like like eye color. That might be something that we could, relatively harmless, changing the eye color of the embryo. But what people are really searching for is the ability to enhance intelligence, or enhance appearance, or enhance personality in some way, or to enhance abilities in some way. Is it possible that we will one day be able to, that prospective parents will be able to look at a menu and select traits and features that they would like for their future child to have, and that the scientists and doctors might be able to take embryos that they create in a laboratory and modify genes to meet the desires and preferences of the parents? Are we doing that now? No. But is it possible? In theory, it is, and could possibly occur. So these are some of the common objections that people bring up when you start to talk about this. And I'm going to deal with them. And I think that some of these objections, though common, are not very strong. And some of these objections have more weight to them. Well, the first one, it's not natural. It's not natural for us to take a human embryo and use CRISPR technology to edit the genes so that the child will grow to be taller, or have a different color of hair, or might have the musical inclinations or greater athletic abilities. It's not natural for us to do that this way. In my view, while that's true, it isn't natural for us to do that. I don't think this is a strong objection, frankly, because there's a lot of things that we do that are not, strictly speaking, natural, that we modify the world around us in all sorts of ways without much concern or care. And I think that's okay. As human beings, that's part of sort of what we do. Is agriculture natural? Are antibiotics natural? Is vaccination natural? No, it's not. But we typically think it's a good idea to do those things. So humans have been altering their environment for a very long time, probably from the very beginning. So I don't know if that by itself is a strong objection to genetic modification. But this one is one that a lot of religious folks and Christian people especially will bring up.
Half an hour ago.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. A little bit of water. So this next objection is one that I hear from Christians and general folks quite a lot, that we are playing God. When we are talking about doing something like this, we are playing God. And again, there might be truth in that, for sure, but I don't believe that is also a strong argument. Some of us perhaps got to this conference by flying in an airplane, or some of us perhaps today have sent an email transferring information at the speed of light, or maybe some of us know someone who's had an organ transplant or been on dialysis. And all of those things have, at one point in time, organ transplants, for example, a lot of these things have been called examples of playing God. And yet, those things are generally seen as uncontroversial today. So, while I'm not saying that we can never say this and that it's never accurate to say this, but there needs to be more, in my view. There needs to be more in our objections than just simply saying that. But I'll let you sort of respond in a few moments when we break for some questions. The third objection on my screen here is messing with the ecosystem. Well, there's objectively probably some problems with that. If we go in and start altering the genes of organisms, plants, animals, insects. So I read a poll from the Pew Research Foundation from 2018, so just a year old, in which they surveyed Americans about their views regarding gene modification or genetic engineering. And one of the questions was, if we could genetically modify mosquitoes so that they no longer carried malaria or the Zika virus, or many of the other dangerous viruses and microbes that they carry, by genetically modifying the mosquito, would that be acceptable? Most people were okay with that, not surprisingly. Most people were okay with that. If all the mosquitoes die out, then maybe all the bats will die, and if all the bats died, then who's going to pollinate all of our crops and our plants? So messing with the ecosystem, that is, there's probably objectively, scientifically speaking, probably some merit to that concern, okay? The next three, however, are things that I think are very serious. Not that the others weren't, but that we may be creating a new type of class struggle, that we may devalue human life, and that we may inspire some new movement of eugenics. I'll talk about each of those, but I want to talk about the eugenics piece for a second. Eugenics is a term that when it gets used, people usually associate that term with the Nazis, the Third Reich, the atrocities of the Holocaust in Germany in the late 1930s to the mid-1940s. We tend to think of eugenics as the Nazi program to create the master race. The word eugenics simply means good genes or good birth. But what people don't often know is that the United States actually has quite a checkered history in the eugenics area. And I'm not just going to talk about it for a couple of minutes, then I'll come back to CRISPR. But I do think it's history that we as Americans, and particularly as American Christians or pro-life people, need to be aware of. In the early part of the 20th century, many intellectuals in the United States were calling for eugenic policies and eugenic laws. There was a lot of concern, and I've recently been doing a little bit of study on the history of my own denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and some of the writers from the 19-teens and 20s and 30s and what they might have been saying at that time about eugenics, because many churches were complicit in the call for eugenic laws. There was a lot of concern that the racial genetic purity of North America was being diluted or polluted by immigrants or by people with bad genes. Okay? About 30 states, I'll just make a long story short, about 30 states ended up passing laws for mandatory or compulsory sterilization for certain types of people. California was the worst out of all the states. More people were sterilized against their will in the state of California between the years about 1915 to about 1960 than in the rest of the country combined. People that were mentally disabled, people that were physically disabled, people that were developmentally challenged, criminals, people that were seen as promiscuous or immoral, many times when they were institutionalized, were against their wishes, sterilized. And anyway, this is a part of American history that many people don't know, that the Germans actually modeled some of what they wanted to do on things that were actually happening here. Of course, they went much further and were much more extreme, but some of the same thinking existed. Now, why do I bring all that up when I'm talking about gene modification? Because it seems to me that there is the possibility of history repeating itself, that there is the possibility that we might develop into the kind of society that evaluates people according to physical abilities or physical appearance. Now, we already are a society that evaluates people on those bases. But once we are able to modify the genes of our children, what do you think we will begin to do? So someone might say to me, you know, I would never do that. I would never choose to have my own children modified no matter what, because I think that children are a gift from God, and I would not want to go in, maybe to cure a disease, but not to go in and select traits off of a menu so that I can have the perfect baby or the perfect child. But parents, I think, will be under a lot. We may be talking about a few years down the road or a couple of decades down the road, but I think that as these things become cheaper, I think they will become more available, and I think that some families will feel pressured to take advantage of these things. If most parents will do a lot to give their children the best advantage that they can in life. We do a lot to modify our kids, don't we? We school them, homeschool them, or send them to private schools or parochial schools or the best public schools that we can. We give them piano lessons and tennis lessons and dance lessons and so on. And all of that is good and fine. But for some people, it is just another step to modify their genes so that they will have more propensity for those different abilities. So I'm looking at the clock and I'm seeing that it is 5:45, and I want to allow for some discussion if there is any. So my slide projector person, let's just go to the second to the last slide. You can skip through if you're able to. I'm sorry, there's a lot. I wasn't sure how quickly I'd be able to get through things. Okay, go back one. Right there. Okay, let's just talk about this for a few minutes. Should parents genetically modify their children? Now that I've given you a little bit of history, a little bit of a science lesson, we've talked a little bit about ethics and theology. So what are the pros and cons? Should parents modify their children? I'm going to keep talking, but I want you to feel comfortable to raise your hand at this point if you have anything you'd like to contribute or questions that you would like to ask. So, pros. At least, I think a lot of people would agree that curing genetic diseases will be good. I think most people would agree that would be something worth doing if we're able to do that. So that is going to be listed as probably the very first pro. And that's where the research is being conducted the most at present in terms of trying to identify genes that cause devastating illnesses. Then another pro would be, as I said a moment ago, parents, once we're able to cure diseases, and as our understanding of the human genome increases, as we begin to understand what genes do and how they interact with other genes, we may wish to modify our children so that they have certain traits and capabilities. And it will always be framed in terms of giving our children the best advantage, the most competitive edge in life. Do you want to be the only parents on the block? So let me give you an example. Let me suggest another example of an enhancement that is not as radical as a genetic modification, but that is already kind of an issue and a problem on many college campuses today, in the United States at least. And that is the widespread misuse of things like Adderall and Ritalin. Adderall and Ritalin are widely prescribed and often for very, very good reasons. To help children who are hyperactive, attention deficit, to concentrate. But it is a drug that is widely abused on college campuses by students who do not have a diagnosis and do not have a prescription. And they're able to acquire these drugs because they believe that if it helps someone with ADHD study better, and I don't have ADHD, it's going to help me study better all the more. Adderall, even on college campuses today, is called the study buddy. People will take it. Now there's not a lot of evidence that it actually does do that. That there's not a lot of scientific studies that one can point to that show that someone without ADHD, that their ability to learn and retain information is greatly enhanced. But there are medical risks. There are medical dangers for taking a drug that has not been prescribed to you. So I suggest that if we are a very competitive culture, and as people who might want to get into the best law school or get into the best medical school. They might take a drug that is not prescribed for them in order to help them have a little bit of a competitive edge. Then I do think that we are the kind of society that would probably partake of genetic engineering. The cons are the things that I have mentioned. For one thing, it buys into this notion that beauty and value and happiness are determined by superficial characteristics. That if I look a certain way, if I'm taller, if I have greater athletic ability, that will make me happy. Another con is that this is it would be difficult to reverse. It would be irreversible. It would be very invasive. It's very personal when you start talking about changing someone's genetic makeup. It gives parents a great deal of sense of control, and perhaps not in a good way. It turns children into projects, and it goes back to what I was saying, perhaps this idea that we want to create sort of a master race. We want to be better than our neighbor. And these sorts of things will be available to the rich much sooner than they would be available to the average person or to somebody who is poor. So that's where the possible new class struggle comes in. Okay, so those are my pros and cons. Any questions? Any comments? Yes, please.
My daughter is type 1 diabetes, but the question that was raised to me this morning actually was if I knew ahead of time that she was going to have diabetes, would I have chosen to, if there was a genetic way of preventing that from happening, would I have chosen that way if it was offered to me?
Right.
But the second part of that discussion is that now there's a difference between genetically modifying and preventing that disease from happening, but also advancements in science of transplanting pancreas.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
I mean, so that the advancements of science are making headway in not altering, genes.
Other ways to correct the...
Yeah, other ways of that.
Sure.
No doubt that there has been a lot of good that has come about because she's diabetic and dependent upon insulin on a daily basis. But from the spiritual aspect
Sure.
of having a child that is like that.
Sure. Yeah.
It seems like there's just a real fine line between doing something like you're suggesting that science is able to do,
Yeah.
and then the alternative, advancements of medication and medicine.
There might be less invasive ways, less personal ways to go in and help or correct or cure. So there's a book called The Case Against Perfection by Michael Sandel. He's a Harvard professor. He's not a Christian, so he doesn't write from a Christian perspective, although he has a lot of sort of religious-like language. But he says that it's important for parents to it's important for parents to accept their children, to accept their children, to accept the unbidden. Now, what I often hear, you mentioned diabetes, but what I often hear are parents with maybe a child with Down syndrome. And what parents have told me is that if they were offered the opportunity to go back in time and change the genes and chromosomes of that child, that they probably wouldn't do it, because that is so much of who that child is, and there's so that this is a complex question. Even when we're talking about curing disease, it is a complex question, no doubt. Yeah, so I appreciate your comment on that. Yes, please. Well, if we're going to do the genetic modifications, there are some therapies that, I mean, what's easiest is to do it when you have an embryo in a dish. That's easiest, okay? So, but there are therapies there are hundreds of therapies that are in development right now for genetic diseases of adults. That we might, if a person has a genetic disorder, they might be able to one day take a drug that will alter the genes in their body in such a way that it will cure the disease. So that's a bit further down the future. What we can do now is alter embryos in a dish. Yes.
I was just going to say one of the growing areas in the adoption world is in snowflake adoption.
Right, sure.
Adoptions. I just think that's an important comment that many Christians go into IVF are also making that move to ensure that the children are not just disposed.
So that the embryos are not frozen indefinitely or destroyed eventually. Yes, I've actually met a young lady from Southern California and their family that say that they believe that they were the first snowflake baby. So yeah, it's very interesting. Good comment. Thank you for that. Over here. Yeah. Well, okay, so I teach at Concordia, but you don't have to be a Christian to be a student at Concordia. And even if they are a Christian, these are sometimes topics they've not thought through. And sometimes we, even as Christians, are as much influenced by the world more than we should be. So to answer your question, I see a wide range of responses. And I do think there is reason for hope. There are a lot of young adults that I teach who are going to be nurses, medical professionals, that I teach every semester, that do have sort of a reaction, a response to some of this stuff. That there is a sort of I don't want to say knee-jerk response because that sounds negative, but there is sort of an immediate caution about going in and changing genes. So I mean, at least with that topic, I find that at least with some of my students, or I would say many of my students, that they have sort of a natural conservatism in that way. They're not, they understand about curing cystic fibrosis, but they are very alert and attuned to the concern about these elective, non-essential, non-medical alterations. So I think there is reason for some hope for the future. Other comments, questions? Oh, yes.
You mentioned earlier that many people in our congregations are considering in vitro fertilization or have gone through that process.
Sure. Right.
I think there's a disconnect in that they don't necessarily understand what happens in IVF. Do you have any suggestions on how to speak to the people in our churches in a loving way? Because it's really hard when they find life to be very important, but they're also putting all of their hopes for a family on IVF.
On IVF. Well, IVF is definitely ethically complicated because of what are we doing with embryos that are not transferred or implanted into their mother. I think that we have to talk about it, to be honest. I think we just have to be unafraid to speak openly in our churches, in our communities, and in our families, in our confirmation instruction with young people. I think there ought to be a little attention paid to some of these bioethical questions like IVF, because if you're talking, once somebody is considering it, because they've been struggling with infertility, then they are perhaps emotionally in a different place, and it's more difficult to present some of the cautions that we might want to present to them. But I think if we can be unafraid, I found as a pastor, so I've been been a professor for 5 years, but I was a pastor for 20 years before that. So what I found as a pastor in my experience was just that if I talked about stuff from the pulpit, then it gave people permission to talk to their pastor about it. So not that I talked about social issues constantly or anything like that, but if I would mention IVF, or if I would mention abortion, or if I would mention the sacredness of the life of a human embryo in the pulpit, that would give people permission, it seemed, to speak with me, or that it was okay and that we'd talk about these things in the church. It has to start, I think, with the leaders. But we do need to be talking about this, and perhaps at younger ages. Yes.
Medical ethics.
Sure.
It seems to me that as you deal with the students, there's a great barrier between the pharmaceutical associations and the medical ethics of the medical profession, the doctors, the turnout, and the nurses in the turnout.
Sure.
And cure for cancer.
Right.
There are some cures for cancer, and according to the research that I do, that the medical profession, ethically speaking, should be considering these, but because of conflict of interest.
Right.
Ethically speaking,
Right.
you're training these people
Yeah.
to be practitioners,
Yeah.
and they're going to be flooded with dollars and cents. Medical ethics.
Yeah.
Boy, oh boy, that seems to be a real problem.
Well, I think you touched on it when you mentioned conflict of interest. Sure. Yes. There is a profit motive. There's always going to be that. People are sinful. So I teach nurses, and their approach is a little different. But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I think you have touched on a very important matter there, for sure. Yes.
Regarding the gene editing and what parents attempted then to make changes so that their children would be more successful in life.
Yeah.
I think clearly when the proposal is we have something that can address trisomy, and now you won't have a trisomy baby, pretty much everyone gets on board with that. What I find, what I'm wondering about, and I'm hoping maybe you can inform me, because you know more about the genetic horizon than I do. It seems to me that a lot of research that's done in diseases, where they're starting, and then with things like 23andMe.
You're right. Right.
They're doing. It seems a lot of things that really don't directly impact success in life. We calculate that you are 63% more likely to like asparagus.
Right. Or to have curly hair, or what? Yeah.
Those things are not even 100%.
Right.
Recently, even Newsweek magazine, far a friend of conservatives and Christians, ran an article how the recent research pretty much shows there's no gay gene.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
It's supposed to be disappointing news to the alphabet people.
Sure.
You don't have now 53 different genes for 53 different genders.
No.
So I'm wondering, well, what would they come up with where they can actually say, other than maybe just to make your child more beautiful, because he does equate to some social success. And
Sure.
more success in life.
Sure.
But in terms of physical ability, mental ability, what would they come up with? Because so much of that really is nurture, not nature.
Well, there's a lot to your question, and there's yes, nurture does play a role, a very important role, and I think many things that lend to success in life are a combination of nature and nurture, and some sort of an interesting documentary, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll just talk for a minute or two more. there's an interesting documentary that you could view called the name of it just went out of my head, but it's about 3 identical triplets who are separated at birth and find each other later in life. And what the documentary brings out is how similar people are. And there have been a lot of twin studies, and especially twins that are separated and raised in different nurturing, different environments, and still end up very similar. And why is that? So the genetic factor in your personality is not all of it. It's not completely fatalistic according to your genes, but it is. Your genes do to some extent drive and motivate you in powerful ways.
And I don't mean to question that
Sure.
significance, but I'm getting at, because certainly it's real.
Sure.
I don't deny that. What I'm wondering with your knowledge is, what would they be able to come out and say this?
Yeah.
So, what do they look at? Like, this is the thing we can do for your child that's going to make them more successful.
Well, the sort of the holy grail, or the thing that they're going after, but it's a long way from ever being possible, I believe, and that would be intelligence. If there was, if there was some, but there's not going to be one gene. There's not one IQ gene, right? Right. There's going to be thousands of genes, and how they interact with each other. And so now people talk about how with advances in computing technologies, it may be AI that is the one that solves this problem for us eventually. But we're talking somewhere down the future. But maybe our grandkids or our great-grandkids, there might be some modest advances in that direction. For personality, for like gregariousness, or impulse control. I mean, but again, they're not going to be single genes. Single genes we can do, but and so right now it's going to be very simple traits generally, but when it comes to things like intelligence, or or even musical ability or whatever, it's yeah right very good. Okay, my 40-second one, 34 seconds. Okay, is there a 34-second question? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your attention. I appreciate the opportunity. God bless.